In this video, I'll show you how to use spreadsheets to compute Riemann sums. For this example, we're going to consider the function f of x equals x times the natural log of x on the interval 1 to 5. We'll be doing this using n equals 6, that is, 6 rectangles of equal width. In order to get the rectangles to be equal width, we'll need to compute delta x, which is equal to b, that's 5, minus a, that's 1, all over n, which is 6. That gives us delta x is 2/3. As before, I'm using Google Docs as my spreadsheet program. If you choose to use Excel or another spreadsheet program, the method that we'll use is essentially the same. I've opened a fresh sheet and I've given it a name, Riemann sum example. Giving it a name is optional, but I like doing it all the same. Let's start by labeling the columns we're going to use. I like to use x, and since we're talking about f of x, I'll use f of x. Now let's tell the spreadsheet exactly what x values we want to use. Remember, our interval was 1 to 5, so I'm going to start by putting 1, that's our a value, in box A2. Now to get the rest of the x values, we'll use the power of the spreadsheet to fill them in without having to do any computations of our own. So in the box right underneath where you typed in 1, let's start by typing in the equals symbol. Remember, the equals symbol tells the spreadsheet that you're about to enter a function, something that it's going to compute. Now I've gone ahead and done the full computation, even though we already know delta x is 2/3. Remember that delta x is equal to b minus a over n. I've typed that here. Remember, delta x is the width of each rectangle, so the endpoint of that next sub-interval will be delta x plus whatever the x value was at the previous sub-interval. So, to go back over this computation, remember that we are looking at delta x plus a, which was in the box right above. When you press the Enter key, that value for x should appear. Now to get the rest of our x values, we will use the Fill Down feature. Notice that the bottom right-hand corner of the cell that's highlighted looks like a little blue square. If you click in that square and drag down, the rest of the values for x will fill in automatically. Since n equals 6, we'll need 7 x values. Since row 1 was devoted to our label, that means that we're going to go all the way down to row 8. This isn't a computation you have to do every time. If you want, you can just click in the box and drag it down. If you go too far, it's easy to delete the extra ones that you don't need. If you don't go far enough, click in the new little blue box in your lowest cell and drag it down until you have enough. Now we have all of our x values. It's time to tell the spreadsheet what function we're using. Since we're using f of x equals x times ln of x, we're going to type that underneath f of x. That's in column B. Since this is going to be a formula for the spreadsheet to compute, we'll start as always with an equal symbol. And then every time we want an x, we'll click in the box that contains the x value we care about. If you're setting yours up like you've set mine up, that's the box immediately to the left. So, I'll type in equals x and remember, that's A2, times, make sure you use the multiplication symbol for times, the natural log of A2. As you start to type the name of a function, the spreadsheet will pop up some possible completions for the function that it thinks you might be typing. Make sure that it enters the correct one. The description will appear underneath. Now hit the Enter key, and that value for f of x will appear. As before, we'll click in the blue box and drag down to fill in all of our f of x values. Now it's time to actually compute the sums. I like to put labels over here in column D, corresponding to the left-hand sum, right-hand sum, and midpoint sum. That'll make it easier for you to keep track of them when it's time to type in your answers. So, to compute the sum, again, we're putting in a formula, so we'll use an equal symbol. Now I want the spreadsheet to add up all of the f of x values that correspond with left-hand endpoints of our subintervals. So, I'll start by typing sum and then parentheses. Now, to tell the spreadsheet what to add up, I think it's easiest to click in the first cell that you want, hold it, and drag it down until all the cells that you want are covered. Notice that because this is a left-hand sum, we are not using the right-hand endpoint of the very last interval. Once we've entered the sum, remember we need to multiply by delta x. And remember, delta x is 2/3. There it is, right there on the end. And again, don't forget to use the multiplication symbol, the star. Let's do the same thing for the right-hand sum. Here, because we're looking at the right-hand sum, we will not use the left-hand endpoint of the very first subinterval. To compute the midpoint sum, we need a different set of x values. The x values that we need are the midpoints of the intervals that are defined in our table above. There are a couple of different ways to do this. I think the most straightforward way is to compute what exactly that first midpoint is. Here's how I did it. We're starting at the left-hand endpoint of the far left interval. Remember, that's just our value for a. If I add 2/3 to a, that takes me to the next x value on our list. But I only want to go half that far. So what I'm going to do is add 2/3 divided by 2. That'll take us halfway to the next interval. Here you see the 2/3, that's delta x divided by 2. Now when you hit enter, the midpoint of the first subinterval should appear. Do a quick spot check. Is the number that just appeared halfway between the first two numbers on the list? It looks like we got it right. Now, the next midpoint is a full width of one subinterval away from the previous one. So, to get the next one, I'll type equals, because we're going to do this as a formula. I'll click in the box for the first midpoint. Remember, that's the one just above. Plus delta x, that's 2/3. And push enter. As before, it's a good idea to make sure that the number that you just ended up with is halfway between the second and third x values in the chart above. Now, as before, we'll click in the blue box and drag down to compute the rest of the midpoints. In this case, there are 6 intervals, so there should be 6 midpoints. That's how many we've got, so we're ready to go. Now, because column B still has our formula for f of x in it, we can click on the last place where we had the function. In this case, that's cell B8. Click in the blue box and drag it down, and it'll compute our new values for f of x. Next, we'll type in the formula. The midpoint sum is equal to, don't forget the equal sign, the sum of those 6 new y values times delta x. Push enter and you're done. Here are our 3 Riemann sums.